She married a silent human, until his sword awakened the world. The hall smelled wrong. That was the first thing I registered when I walked in. Not the delegates arranged in careful rows like teeth in a jaw. Not the flags of 43 coalition species hanging from a ceiling so high it had its own weather. Not the cameras. Not the silence that fell when the doors opened. The smell, something burnt underneath everything else, like old metal and older decisions. I kept walking. My name is Vera Solen, third daughter of the Kale diplomatic house, and I had been traded for a trade agreement. That is the honest version. The official version used words like union of unity and historic bridge between peoples, and I had read the official version so many times in the 3 weeks before the ceremony that the words had stopped meaning anything at all. They were just sounds, decorative sounds, the kind species make when they want to do something that would look ugly without decoration. I was not angry about it. I want to be clear about that, because my people feel emotions the way your radio towers broadcast signals, and anyone standing close enough can catch the frequency. If I had been angry, the 7 Kale attendants flanking me would have felt it in their chest cavities. They would have swayed. They did not sway. I walked steady and they walked steady, and the hall full of 43 species watched a Kale bride cross marble flooring toward a human representative, and nobody in that room felt a thing from me. Because I was not angry, I was curious. That is the Kale affliction, if you want to call it one. Not emotion, curiosity, the drive to measure, catalog, understand. My mother called it our best quality. My sister called it the reason I had no friends. Both of them were right. I was curious about humans. Every species in the coalition had an opinion about them. The Dressen thought they were reckless. The Vor thought they were useful in the specific way that sharp tools are useful, which is to say valuable and slightly frightening. The Sen didn't think about them at all, which was its own kind of opinion. Humans had been in the coalition for 60 years, long enough to matter, not long enough for anyone to stop watching them sideways. What I knew, they were short-lived by galactic standards. They were adaptable in ways that occasionally bordered on disturbing. They had a history they didn't volunteer information about, and when other species asked, they answered in the specific way that people answer questions they have already decided not to fully answer. Politely, with just enough information to make you feel satisfied until you thought about it later. And they were quiet. Not all of them. I had met loud humans, enthusiastic ones who filled rooms with noise and motion and the specific energy of a species that has recently discovered space travel and hasn't gotten used to the size of everything yet. But the quiet ones, the still ones, they were something else entirely. He was at the altar already when I entered the hall. I noticed that. He had not made an entrance. He had simply arrived before anyone else and positioned himself and gone still, like furniture, like something that had been there long enough to be considered part of the architecture. He was not tall by human standards. I had done my reading. Average height, average build, the kind of face that takes a moment to fully assemble in memory, because it is composed entirely of things that seem ordinary until you add them together and arrive somewhere unexpected. His dress uniform was dark, pressed to a geometry that suggested whoever did his laundry had opinions about precision. And at his hip, on a belt that had no business being part of a diplomatic ceremony, was a sword. Not a ceremonial weapon. I knew what those looked like. Ceremonial weapons are decorative. They are meant to be seen. They catch light. They make a statement about heritage and tradition and the pride of whoever is carrying them. This was not that. This was a used thing, scratched at the guard. The scabbard worn soft at the edges from something that had rubbed it regularly for a long time. The handle wrapped in material so dark I couldn't identify it from a distance, and the wrapping done not in any decorative pattern but in tight, close, functional rows, like the handle of a tool that needed not to slip. I catalogued it, filed it, kept walking. The official in the center said the official words. I said the words I had practiced. He said his. His voice was even and low and carried exactly as far as it needed to carry, no further, the way a person speaks when they have learned that volume is something you spend only when necessary. I waited for his mind. This is what my people do. It is not intrusion. It is instinct. The way you might lean toward warmth without deciding to. When a kale stands close enough to another thinking being, we feel the shape of their emotional state. Not thoughts, not specifics, just the shape. Joy feels like expanded space. Grief feels like pressure from the inside. Fear has a specific texture that I cannot describe in any language except kale, and even then only approximately. From him standing close enough to touch, nothing. Not nothing like an absence, not nothing like a blocked signal, not the enforced blankness of someone who has learned to shield themselves. I have felt all of those. They have specific textures too. This was nothing like a room that had been very quietly, very completely, very thoroughly prepared. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me, not studying, not cataloging, just looking the way you look at something you have decided to pay attention to and have not yet decided what to think. I looked back. The official finished speaking. A sound went through the room that I think was applause, though the timing felt more like relief. I thought he is empty. I thought, or I don't have the instruments for him yet. Both possibilities were interesting. The reception afterward was the kind of event that exists to give species a structured reason to look at each other. Food I didn't recognize, lined tables I didn't care about. Delegates circulated with the specific purposeful motion of people working. The Dressen ambassador said something warm to me about interspecies harmony that I could tell he had rehearsed. The Vor Council member shook my hand with 4 of her 6 hands, which is their version of sincerity. I said the right things to each of them. I had been trained for this since I was 9 years old. He stood near the window for most of it. Not hiding, not sulking, just positioned himself where the natural current of the room didn't require navigation, and he watched, and occasionally someone approached him and he spoke to them, and they went away looking slightly more settled than when they had arrived. I noticed that. The way he had of answering questions that made the questioner feel that the answer had been exactly the right size. Once, in the middle of a conversation with a Sen delegate about shipping lanes, I felt something. Not from him, about him, from the Sen delegate whose emotional signal I was catching as easily as breath. A flavor of wariness that sharpened when he looked across the room toward the window. Complicated wariness, not dislike. Something more like the feeling of standing near a very deep drop and being aware that the ground is stable for now because physics says so. I filed that too. Near the end of the reception, he was beside me, and I didn't know how he had moved across the room because I hadn't seen it happen. He was simply there and he said quietly, "Are you tired?" Not "Are you enjoying yourself?" Not "This is going well." Not any of the standard diplomatic filler that people use to fill silence when silence makes them uncomfortable. Just the question, direct, aimed. "Yes," I said, because it was true and because I was curious what he would do with it. He said, "We can leave when you want to." That was all. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the evening, the precision of it, not "we should stay a little longer." Not "I understand, but the Dressen ambassador hasn't had his 3rd conversation yet." Just a clean fact. Departure was possible, the timing was mine, and he had no competing preference to negotiate against. I had spoken to a great many beings in my diplomatic career. Very few of them were capable of having no competing preference. Most preferences are just quieter than others. We left when I wanted to. In the transport back to the residential quarter, I asked him about the sword. I had been thinking about it since the altar, the wrapping on the handle, the worn scabbard. I asked, "What is that?" He looked down at it, not at me, at the sword. The way you look at something you have a relationship with, and are in the middle of deciding how to describe that relationship to someone new. Then he looked up. "Old," he said. I waited. He didn't add to it. I filed it, the non-answer that wasn't defensive, the boundary that didn't feel like a wall, just a fact about geography. Here is where the path goes. Here is where it does not go. No apology for the terrain. The transport moved through the city and he looked out the window, and I looked at him and I thought, either there is nothing in there, or I am standing outside the largest building I have ever encountered, and I haven't found a door yet. Both possibilities were interesting. His name was Aldrich Voss. I thought I had married a man with nothing inside him. I was half right. He had packed it all into something else. The first thing I learned about how Aldrich kept a house was that he woke up before I did. Every morning, without exception. By the time my consciousness surfaced from Kale's sleep, which is longer and deeper than human sleep and involves a degree of sensory shutdown that my species finds refreshing and most others find alarming, he had already been awake for what the apartment's internal clock told me was between 1 and 2 hours. I know because I started checking. Not out of suspicion, out of the same compulsion that makes me check atmospheric readings on any new planet before I check the view. Information first, then interpretation. He was always at the kitchen table or near the window, or once, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the main room with his back straight and his eyes open and his hands on his knees, not moving, not apparently doing anything that had a name. I walked past him that morning and went to get water and came back and he was still there. And I sat on the couch and watched him and he didn't react for 11 minutes, and then he exhaled, long and controlled, and stood up like a conversation had ended. "Morning," he said. "What were you doing?" I asked. He considered the question. "Accounting," he said. I didn't ask what he was accounting for. The way he said it suggested the answer would require more context than the morning had time for, and I had started to understand that Aldrich Voss parceled information in amounts calibrated to what you could actually use right now. Giving you more would have felt like waste to him. I think waste, in all its forms, was something he found quietly offensive. The second thing I learned was that he cooked. Not well at first. Kale dietary needs are specific. Our food culture is built around compounds that most species either can't source or can't process, and the flavor profiles we prefer map to sensory receptors that humans simply don't have. I had expected to manage my own nutrition the way I had managed it on every diplomatic assignment, which is to say with a portable processor, and the specific resigned attitude of someone who has accepted that food, for them, is fuel and not pleasure while away from home. He made me something on the third morning. I don't know what it was. It was wrong in about 4 different ways. The texture was approximate, and the warmth was calibrated for human comfort rather than kale, and one of the primary compounds was present but sourced from the wrong plant family, which changes the molecular weight enough to land about 30% off target in terms of what it does when it reaches your system. I ate it. It was the effort that mattered, and I told him it was good, which was partially true. He looked at me for a moment, not suspicious, measuring. "It wasn't right," he said. "It was close," I said. "Close isn't right," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. 2 weeks later, he made me something else. I don't know when he had been researching or what he had used because he hadn't asked me any questions and I hadn't seen any new equipment. But what he set in front of me was within 10% of what my system needed, which is a margin my people consider acceptable, and the temperature was correct, and the sourcing was different, better. I looked at him. He sat down with his own food and started eating. I found the notebooks 3 months into our arrangement, not by snooping but by accident. I was looking for a stylus in the study drawer, and I found 2 of them first, then the third under a technical manual for something I didn't recognize. Small notebooks, covered in his handwriting, which was precise and small and packed close together, as if he had made a decision about not wasting page space. The first notebook was full of kale dietary chemistry, molecular tables, compound lists, cross-references to plant families and their galactic sourcing options, notes in the margins in his small handwriting. This source is available from Dresden suppliers. This compound degrades if heat exceeds a certain point. This combination is what my people call comfort adjacent, circled twice. Comfort adjacent, circled twice. I stood in the study for a while with that notebook in my hands. He had not told me he was doing this. He had not asked me to teach him. He had observed, researched, and worked on it alone, and presented me with the results not as a gift requiring acknowledgement, but just as breakfast on a plate on the table, as if it had always been that way. I thought about the word gift. I thought about how my people give gifts, which is with ceremony and announcement and the expectation of reciprocal emotional broadcast, so the giver can feel the receiver's gratitude and know it landed. I thought about how this was nothing like that. There had been no announcement, no ceremony. The gratitude he was apparently not waiting for. He had just done it. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it, at the same angle, under the same manual, because he had not chosen to tell me it existed, and I did not want to take that choice from him. The sword was on the wall in the study. He had put it up on the second day, on a pair of simple hooks he had attached to the wall with the specific practicality of a man who has hung things on walls before and knows what works. Not decorative hooks, not a display case, just hooks. The sword horizontal, the handle to the right. Every seventh day he took it down. I noticed the pattern by accident and then confirmed it deliberately. 7-day intervals without fail. He would take it down and sit with it at the study table, and what he did was not sharpening exactly, though he did pass a cloth along the edge. It was more like inspection, like checking on something, making sure it was still what it had been. He did it quietly, and he did it alone, and he put it back when he was done, and the rest of the day continued the same way it had been going. I did not ask him about it again after the transport. He did not explain it. The wrapping on the handle was still dark and still unreadable to me, and I had started to understand that the unreadability was not accidental. 4 months in, we attended a coalition diplomatic function at the Dresden Cultural Center. Formal event. Full attendance from 17 member species, which meant the room was dense with beings and agendas, and the low-grade political electricity that collects when that many power structures are in the same space. I worked the room. I was trained for this. I moved from conversation to conversation with the efficiency of someone who has mapped the social architecture in advance and knows which load-bearing walls to visit first. I kept Aldrich in my peripheral awareness. He operated differently, slowly traversing the room on what appeared to be a longer circuit, stopping where he stopped, speaking when he spoke. At some point I was in conversation with a delegate from the Sen trading bloc, a man named Counselor Irev, whose emotional signal I was catching with the same ease I catch all close proximity signals. He was content, professionally engaged, standard for him. Then he looked across the room at something over my shoulder, and his signal sharpened into that complicated wariness I had felt from the Sen delegate at our wedding reception. The exact same flavor. I didn't turn immediately. I finished my sentence to Irev. Then I turned, following the direction of his gaze. Aldrich had stopped near a cluster of Dresden delegates. One of them, a tall man with the specific confidence of someone accustomed to small audiences, was speaking. The other Dresden delegates were laughing, the kind of laughter that has a target. I caught the words. My Dresden is functional enough for that. The joke was about the Kale tendency toward long sleep cycles and what that said about the quality of Kale company. It was aimed at me, constructed for a Dresden audience, spoken in a language its speaker had every reason to assume the human standing 3 feet away couldn't understand. Aldrich said nothing. He turned his head and looked at the man. I watched it happen from across the room. The man was still composing his expression toward the end of the joke, still riding the anticipation of the laugh, and then he looked at Aldrich and the laugh didn't arrive. His expression did something strange. It tried to hold its shape and couldn't. Aldrich had not moved. His face had not done anything I could put a name to from the distance. His posture had not changed. He had simply turned and looked, and whatever was in that look reached across the space between them and landed with a weight that the joke could not carry. The Dresden delegate looked away first. Aldrich continued his circuit of the room. On the transport home, I sat with what I had seen and tried to classify it. I kept arriving at the same place. It was not a threat, not a warning exactly. It was closer to what I had called the math look in my own mind since the first time I saw it on our wedding day. The look of someone who has noticed a variable and run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion, and is giving you a moment to arrive at it yourself before the math becomes your problem rather than theirs. The Dresden delegate had arrived, quickly. I looked at Aldrich in the transport. He was looking out the window. "You understood," I said. "Dressin' is not difficult," he said. "How many languages do you speak?" I asked. He thought about it. The thought took long enough that I understood it wasn't a simple count. "Enough," he said. I sat with that. Enough, not 14 or 7 or some specific number presented with either modesty or pride. Enough, calibrated exactly to what was true and nothing past it. I stopped thinking of him as empty somewhere between the second notebook and the third. What I had was worse. I had no category for what he was, and for a Kale, that is the most unsettling condition imaginable. The mission to the Kethara contested system was not supposed to be dangerous. I want to say that first because I have told this story to other people, and they always assume we were given some kind of warning, some briefing that should have prepared us, some intelligence that indicated what the station at Kethara 7 was actually being used for. We were not. The Coalition Diplomatic Corps classified it as a standard mediation assignment. 2 resource extraction factions with overlapping territorial claims. The kind of dispute that generates paperwork and tension and resolves, eventually, into a compromise that makes everyone moderately unhappy, which is the Coalition's definition of success. Aldrich packed for it the same way he packed for everything else. One bag, organized with the specific logic of a person who has a system and trusts it. He put the sword in a carrying case that I had not seen before, flat and plain and closed with 2 latches, and he put the case with the bag and did not comment on it. I asked him if he expected trouble. He said, "I expect everything." I thought that was a figure of speech. We took a Coalition transport to Kethara 7 with a standard diplomatic escort. 6 security personnel from the Coalition's general force, 2 comms officers, 1 medical officer, and the 2 of us. The station was mid-sized, extraction industry infrastructure, the kind of place that smells like recycled atmosphere and old hydraulics, and the specific tired energy of people who have been away from anything green for too long. The first 2 days were standard. Meetings in rooms with too many chairs. Representatives from both factions making opening statements that were really just the same 2 positions dressed differently. I managed the room's emotional temperature, which was high and tightly wound, while Aldrich asked questions. Not many questions. Specific ones. The kind that make a room go quiet because the question has identified the actual problem underneath the stated problem, and nobody had been ready to talk about that one yet. I was watching him work, and I was thinking that this was what the notebooks were, too. This quality of his. The ability to sit very still inside a situation until he understood exactly what it was, and then to touch it precisely there and nowhere else. The attack came on the 3rd day. Not at the meeting table. In the corridor between the secondary conference room and the transport bay during a transition, which told me it was planned. You don't accidentally find a diplomatic party in a transit corridor. You know the schedule and you know the route and you position accordingly. There were 9 of them. I saw that much before Aldrich moved his arm in front of me and said quietly, "Behind me, stay there." Not loud, not urgent, the same voice he used to ask if I was tired at our wedding reception. I went behind him. The 6 Coalition security personnel did their job. They did it competently, and they did it with the specific courage of people who have trained for this, and are now inside it, and are discovering that training and reality share a border but are not the same country. 2 of them went down in the first 20 seconds. Not dead, I learned later, but down. And then Aldrich opened the case. He did it without looking at it. The latches by feel. The sword out in emotion so practiced it wasn't emotion anymore. It was just a state change. He had the sword in his hand the way you have a thought. The blade came out of the scabbard, and the sound of it was a very specific sound, edged and quiet, and something in my Kale nervous system registered that sound and filed it in a category I hadn't known I had. I am going to tell you what I saw from behind him in that corridor, and I am going to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you. I cannot give you a clean sequence of events because my mind, during those 4 minutes, was not recording cleanly. It was doing what minds do under conditions of extreme threat, which is to focus intensely on certain details while other details blur. What I have is a set of images that my memory has tried to arrange into order without full confidence in the arrangement. What I know, he moved and he did not make unnecessary motions. Whatever he did in the smallest possible movement that achieved the necessary result, and there was something in that economy that was more alarming than any amount of visible effort would have been. Effort means someone is working hard. Economy means someone has done this enough that hard is no longer the right word. What I know, the corridor went quiet in a way that corridors are not supposed to go quiet. What I know, at some point during those 4 minutes I became aware that I was not afraid. I want to examine that. I was standing in a corridor on a hostile station. An event of active danger was occurring 6 feet in front of me, and I was not afraid. I was watching. My kale attention had locked onto Aldrich the way it locks onto things I do not yet have a category for, and what I felt coming from my own chest was not fear. It was something I do not have a good translation for. In kale, the closest word is the feeling of watching something move that is very good at moving. The feeling you get watching an apex predator in the wild that does not see you. Complicated, not comfortable, not exactly beautiful, but something. Then it was over. He stood in the corridor and looked at what was there, and then looked at the sword in his hand. The way he looked at it, I keep coming back to that. Not triumphant, not relieved, not any of the things that people look like when danger has passed and they are still standing. He looked at the sword the way you look at a letter that has delivered bad news you had already suspected, something confirmed that you had hoped without hope to be wrong about. He did something precise and practiced to the blade, and sheathed it, and turned to me. Not winded. I said, "What are you?" I meant it as a real question, not rhetorical, not horrified. I was cataloging. I was trying to file this new piece of information into a structure that could hold it, and I needed more data to know which structure to use. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "A thing my people made when they were afraid of dying." He paused. "They aren't afraid anymore." That was the whole answer. I held it. I thought about the 60 years of coalition membership. I thought about the way humans answered questions about their history with politely calibrated partial information. I thought about the specific wariness in the Sen delegates' emotional signals whenever they looked at him. I thought about the math look. I thought about the notebooks and the seventh-day oil and the sword on the hooks and the wrapping on the handle that I still could not read. We were in the medical bay when I finally asked him about the wrapping. The medics were finishing with the 2 security personnel who had been injured. I was sitting near Aldrich while he waited to give a formal incident account to the coalition oversight officer. And I don't know what made me ask then, except that something in the sequence of that day had made the question available in a way it hadn't been before. "The wrapping," I said, "on the handle." He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees. "Names," he said. "I can't read the script," I said. "Old English," he said. "Old version of our script, not used much anymore." "Why names?" I asked. He was quiet. Then he lifted the sword slightly from where it rested against the bench beside him and held it out toward me, sideways, the handle facing me. It took me a moment to understand he was offering it. I took it. It was heavier than I had expected. I have held many objects. I have picked up ceremonial weapons twice my own mass and dense decorative pieces from species that build heavy, but this weight was different. This was not material weight, or not only that. I held it and looked at the wrapping and the rows of small characters, tight and close and running from the pommel up toward the guard, and I understood that the handle had once been unwrapped, and then someone had begun adding names, and the adding had continued for a long time. My hands felt the weight of it. I handed it back. He took it the way you take something you have trusted to someone else, and are relieved to have returned, not because they weren't careful, but because its absence was a condition you don't prefer. I did not ask whose names they were. I knew I would not be told yet, and I understood, in a way I could not fully articulate, that knowing would change the weight of everything I was carrying, and I needed a moment before I was ready for that. I had married a diplomat. I was only now meeting the thing diplomacy was the mask for. The word came through official coalition channels, which is how you know something has been decided by people who were afraid. When powerful beings act from strength, they move through back channels, through private communications, through quiet arrangements made over shared meals where no record is produced. When they act from fear, they reach for the legitimacy of official process the way people reach for handrails in the dark. The formal channel, the filed documentation, the meeting with full attendance and recorded transcript. The reformist faction had filed a formal grievance through the Coalition Council within 6 days of the Cathara 7 incident. I read the document. It was 63 pages long, which is how documents look when the actual argument is 3 sentences and the author does not trust it to stand alone. The actual argument was, humans are too dangerous to remain allied with. The Cathara 7 incident confirms a pattern of behavior that the coalition cannot sanction, and the Treaty of Alliance should be reviewed immediately with an eye toward dissolution. 63 pages to say, we are afraid of what we saw and we want it farther away. I understood the fear. I want to say that clearly. I had stood in that corridor. I had felt the weight of that sword with the names I couldn't read. Fear was a reasonable response. Fear was, in fact, I thought, the correct response to having genuinely understood something for the first time. What I did not understand was the translation of fear into removal. The idea that putting distance between yourself and a thing you don't understand makes you safer. My people have a term for this. The word translates approximately as standing in the dark and calling it a solution because you can no longer see the edges of what you're afraid of. The council summoned me. Not Aldrich me. The summons arrived with the specific formal phrasing of an institution that wants you to know it is being scrupulously fair, while it is doing something it has already decided to do. My presence was respectfully requested for a conversation regarding the current diplomatic situation, and the conversation would take place in 3 days in the primary council chamber, with 11 attending members representing the reformist faction and its allied blocs. Aldrich read the summons when I showed it to him. He put it down on the table. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," I said. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Not what should you do, not what do I think you should do, what do you want? I thought about the notebooks. The 4th one had started 2 weeks ago. I had noticed it without meaning to, new entries in his handwriting, what appeared to be Kale's seasonal dietary shifts and how they correlate to atmospheric conditions of my homeworld. He was learning the next level of something he had already gotten right, not because I had asked, not because anything had indicated I was dissatisfied, because he had decided right was not enough when better was available. I thought about what I had felt in the corridor, holding the sword. "I'm going," I said. The council chamber held its own kind of weight. 11-member delegates seated at a curved table designed to project authority, which it did, and also to project neutrality, which it did not. The reformist faction chair was a Vor named Delegate Sarin, a woman whose species communicated partly through deliberate positioning of their secondary limbs, and whose secondary limbs were currently positioned in a way that said, in Vor, "This outcome has been determined, and we are providing you the courtesy of participation." I had sat across from beings like this before. My whole life had been preparation for rooms exactly like this one. They asked me questions, careful ones, structured to lead, the kind of questions that contain their preferred answers the way seeds contain trees. Did I believe the Cathara 7 incident was consistent with coalition principles of de-escalation? Did I have concerns about the capacity of my husband's actions to represent coalition values? Was it possible that the human diplomatic contingent had been given security clearance beyond what the situation had warranted? I let each question finish completely before I answered. This is something I learned young. Rushing to answer a question tells the room you are afraid of the silence. Taking the silence tells the room you are deciding, which implies you have more than one option, which implies power. Then I answered them. Not with anger, not with defense, with what I had, which was better than either of those things. I told them what happened in that corridor in precise sequential detail. I told them what our security escort had encountered, and what the numbers had been, and what the outcome was. I told them that 2 coalition security personnel were alive who might not have been, and that the diplomatic mission which the coalition had sent us on had not failed, and that whatever they thought about how it had not failed, those were the facts of what was. I told them about 63 pages. I said, it took 63 pages to make a 3-sentence argument. What I have to say requires one question. I asked them, if the situation at Kethara 7 had ended differently, would we be having a conversation about whether human diplomatic participation was adequately resourced? Saren's secondary limbs shifted, slightly. The Vor word they made approximately was recalibrating. I came home and Aldrich was in the kitchen, and the apartment smelled like something he was making. Something with the warm, compound base that my people associate with home, and the specific temperature profile that my system prefers, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard me. He turned. "How did it go?" he said. "Possibly well," I said, "probably not enough." He nodded once, slowly, like something he had already calculated. He put a bowl in front of me at the table. Whatever it was right. Not close. Right. Every compound, every temperature, every weight of it landing exactly where it was supposed to. I ate and he sat across from me with his own food, and we didn't speak for a while. This was not uncomfortable. This had not been uncomfortable between us for a long time. The silence between Aldrich and me was not absence. It was the shape of someone who has decided that words should do work or not be sent. "They're going to push for dissolution," I said. "Yes," he said. "What happens then?" I asked. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at me. "Then we find out what 60 years of keeping quiet looks like when it ends," he said. 3 days later, the reformist faction moved to the formal resolution stage. The Coalition Council scheduled a full vote on treaty review. The news moved through diplomatic channels, and then through general communication networks, and then through everything, the way large news moves, filling every space available to it. Aldrich sent a communication to Earth. I was in the adjacent room. The door was open. I was not eavesdropping. I heard because sound carries in a quiet apartment, and he did not lower his voice, which told me something about what he thought about me hearing it. He said, "They know what we are now. Time to decide if that's a problem." Short, clean. The 3-sentence argument where the 63-page version doesn't exist. What answered back was not immediate. There was a pause of the kind that happens when you have sent a signal very far away, and you are waiting for it to arrive and be received, and a response to return. 14 seconds, approximately, which is a long time to stand in a quiet room waiting. Then the answer came. I am not going to tell you what it said because what it said was information and coordinates and logistics, and the technical language of a civilization doing something coordinated. What I can tell you is what it felt like to hear it through an open door in my apartment while standing in the room where the first 3 notebooks still lived in the study drawer. It felt like standing outside a building you thought was empty and hearing, from inside it, the sound of a very large number of people breathing. Not violent, not loud, the sound of presence. Of something that had been there the whole time, waiting for the question. The full council convened for the vote on a Tuesday by Coalition Standard Calendar. We attended, Aldrich and I, in the gallery, not the floor, observers, which was a specific choice his that I understood when I saw the room. The full council is 240 delegates. The reformist faction had worked the room for a week. Their numbers were strong. Saren's secondary limbs, when I found her in the crowd, said something close to concluding. The vote opened. And then the long-range communication officer for the coalition relay station entered the chamber from the side door and crossed to the senior communications desk and handed something to the desk officer, and the desk officer read it and stood up. The chamber waited. The desk officer said, in the careful voice of someone processing what they are saying while they say it, that 17 vessels had entered the coalition's outer monitoring range and were holding at the boundary, and had filed standard peaceful approach documentation, and were waiting for clearance to proceed. 17 vessels. Not an armada, not a battle fleet. The word fleet carries connotations of aggression, of forward motion, of intent. These were 17 ships sitting still at a boundary line, documentation filed, waiting to be invited in. The comms officer, visibly, read the registry of the vessels. She read the flag under which they were registered. The chamber went very quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of 240 beings doing the same calculation at the same time and arriving at the same place. I looked at Aldrich. He was watching the chamber, not the comms desk, not the reformist faction block. The chamber, all of it the way he watched rooms, the way he had watched our wedding reception, taking the measure of a space and everything moving inside it. He did not look satisfied. He did not look triumphant. He looked like someone watching a truth arrive that he had known was true before anyone else in the room believed it, and finding that there is no comfort in being right about a thing that complicated. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. He looked at my hand, then at me. He nodded once very small. The vote was postponed, then 4 days later quietly withdrawn. The treaty held. I have thought about the right way to begin this part of the story, and I keep coming back to the same place. There is no dramatic moment. There is no scene where everything resolves and the music swells and faces turn towards some kind of light. What there is a Tuesday afternoon in our apartment, 3 weeks after the vote was withdrawn, and Aldrich making tea. That's it, that's where I keep starting, because that is where the story actually lives. He was at the counter with his back to me, and the apartment smelled like morning even though it was midday, because he had opened the window and a specific combination of city air, and whatever he was brewing was doing something to the atmosphere of the room that made it feel earlier and slower and safer than a Tuesday had any right to feel. I was at the table with a communication report I was supposed to be reviewing, and I was not reviewing it. I was watching him make tea. He knew the kale temperature window for the water. He had calibrated the cup to it without asking me. He had also, at some point in the last 6 months, found the specific dried compounds from my homeworld's coastal region that my mother used to put in morning tea, and he had them in a small sealed container on the second shelf, and he used exactly the right amount, which is an amount that looks wrong to non-kale eyes because it is less than seems sufficient, but the compounds are concentrated, and the kale palate reads concentration differently. He had figured that out without me telling him. He put the cup in front of me and went back to the counter and started on his own. I thought there are 4 notebooks in the study drawer. I thought he has never mentioned a single one of them. The weeks after the council vote had been busy in the way that political aftermath is always busy, which is to say that the crisis had publicly resolved, while the actual work of resolution was still ongoing in every back room and communication channel, and quietly urgent meeting that the public version of events doesn't include. Aldrich had been called to 6 separate follow-up conversations with coalition members, the reformist faction leaders among them. I had attended 2 of those conversations. In both of them he was gracious. Warm, even in the specific way he was warm, which is without ceremony and without performance, the warmth of a being who has decided to make your comfort a priority and doesn't need you to notice. The delegates who had spent a week building a case against him sat across from him, and he gave them his full attention, and answered their questions, and asked his own, and by the end, they looked like people who had arrived at a dentist appointment dreading something and were leaving lighter than they'd walked in. I watched this happen twice, and both times I felt the same thing, a kind of wonder that didn't have a home anywhere in my training. Delegate Sarin requested a private conversation with me, not through official channels but through a personal communication sent on a Tuesday 2 weeks after everything. In Vor cultural terms, that distinction matters. Official communication is institutional. Personal is individual. She was speaking as Saren, not as Delegate Saren, and the difference was significant. She asked to meet for food, which is what the VOR do when they want a conversation to cost something, meaning when they want both parties to be present as people and not as titles. We met at a small place that served a menu broad enough for mixed species dining, and we ordered things, and she looked at me across the table, and her secondary limbs were positioned, in VOR, as something close to arriving at something. She said, "I want to understand something." I said I would do my best. She said, "You knew, before Cathara 7, before the corridor, you knew what he was." I thought about this honestly. I knew he was more than I could measure, I said. I didn't know the shape of the more. And now, she said. I thought about the notebooks. Now I know some of it, I said. I think knowing all of it is a longer project. She was quiet for a moment. Her secondary limbs moved through something I couldn't read, which is not unusual. My VOR is functional but not expert. My people have a word, she said, for the feeling of standing near something that could end you and choosing to stand near it anyway because what it does is necessary. I waited. We don't have a word for the feeling of living with it, she said. We don't think anyone had thought to need one. I thought about what she meant. I thought about the window at dawn and the sword across his knees and the hand on mine, careful as a question. I thought about the weight of the sword and the names I couldn't read and the 7-day interval and the 4th notebook. I think it feels like breakfast, I said. She looked at me. The right one, I said. Every morning calibrated exactly to what you need, not announced, just there. She absorbed this. Her secondary limbs settled into something I recognized. The VOR posture for I am taking this with me. Aldrich met me outside the restaurant. He had been at a separate meeting, and the timing had aligned without planning. Or what appeared to be without planning, though I had stopped assuming anything about him was without planning. He looked at me when I came out. Good, he said. Productive, I said. You. Resolved something, he said. He did not specify what. He never specified what unless the specification was useful to me, and he was very good at distinguishing between those two categories. We walked home, not a transport. Walking, which was something we had started doing when the distances were short enough, partly because the city was interesting and partly because I had mentioned once, in passing, that my people process information better when moving, and he had filed it and rearranged his defaults accordingly. At some point, walking, I asked him the question I had been carrying since the medical bay at Cathara 7. Not the question about the names. I had figured out part of that. The other question, the one underneath. I said, when we were married, did you know this was all coming? He walked for a moment. I knew something like it was always possible, he said. I know what we look like to other species. What do you look like to yourselves? I asked. This was the longest silence yet. Long enough that 2 city blocks passed under us and the light changed, and a group of dressing children went by on the far side of the street, making the particular sound dressing children make, which is like small bells dropped from different heights. People who remember being afraid, he said. I held that. It stayed with me for the rest of the walk and through the door and into the evening, and honestly, for a long time after that. I am still holding it now. There is something in it that I keep turning over, the way you turn a stone that has an interesting texture, not looking for anything specific but finding something each time anyway. People who remember being afraid. Not people who were afraid and stopped. Not people who overcame it or conquered it or resolved it into something cleaner. People who carry the memory of fear as information. Who pack that memory into something, swords and notebooks and morning tea calibrated to someone else's system, and kept moving. There is a 5th notebook now. I found it not by accident this time. He left it on the table open when he went to a morning meeting. I don't know if he left it open on purpose. I have stopped trying to determine which of his actions are deliberate and which are not, because the distinction may not exist. It is about my homeworld's seasonal observance cycles, the ones tied to the position of our primary star, the way the light quality changes in specific months, and what that light means to Kale emotional experience, which is significant. We are a light-sensitive species in ways that are difficult to explain to beings who don't share the quality. He had sourced academic papers. He had made notes. He had cross-referenced the observance cycles with a calendar and made small marks at certain intervals. The marks were on dates in the coming year. He was not planning for the past. He was planning for what was coming. I stood at the table and looked at the open notebook and the open window and the morning city outside it, and I thought about what Saren had said, about not having a word for the feeling of living with something that could end you. I thought she was wrong about one thing, not wrong to not have the word, but wrong to think no one had needed it before. My people have been needing it since the first one of us stood close enough to something vast and unknown and chose to stay and learn it rather than retreat to the comfort of not knowing. We just call it curiosity. The sword is still on the wall. He oils it every 7th day. The wrapping, I know now, holds the names of people who carried it before him, not family names, not titles. First names only, the old English ones worn smooth by the thumb that runs over them the way you run your thumb over the names of people you are responsible to, people you carry forward. He has run his thumb over those names in the 7-day ritual for as long as he has had the sword, which is a number of years I have not asked, because the answer would make the weight of it fully real, and I think he is the only one who should carry that full weight. What I carry is something else. 4 notebooks in the study drawer. 1 on the table open. Tea at the right temperature every morning without announcement. And a silence that I have lived inside long enough to know it is not absence. It is the sound of someone paying attention. His name was Aldrich Voss. I thought I had married a man with nothing inside him. What I had actually married was someone who had learned, from his people's long and complicated history of being afraid, that the most important things you carry quietly. And that the right word spoken at exactly the right moment is worth more than every word that came before it. And that breakfast made right every morning without asking for credit is its own kind of language. I am still learning to speak it. I think that is the point.